Welcome back to America Right Now. When we think of PTS or post-traumatic stress, we normally think of our military or our veterans, but first responders and frontline workers like police officers, firefighters, even nurses and paramedics deal with post-traumatic stress as well. The average police officer, for instance, will experience an average of 20 traumatic incidents per year on the job that could bring on PTS. Most people experience just 4 to 6 in their lifetimes. Caring for our first responders is a national challenge, and one organization is doing its part to help the psychological, neurological, emotional, and relational well-being of those who help take care of us. In this edition of our Patriot of the Week, we salute Susan Farron. She is the founder and executive director of First Responders Resiliency, Inc., a nonprofit organization. We also want to welcome Luis Espinoza, police officer and Army vet, who has dealt with PTS and has used this innovative program to help him get his life back on track. Susan, great to see you. You served as a paramedic for more than 30 years. How did you go from first responder to helping first responders?
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for the question. And the honest answer here is that I had a massive life change. I went through an issue where I was diagnosed with what was initially thought was terminal kidney cancer. And that led to having major surgery. And one of the surgeons came in about 3 days after my operation and said, "We see a lot of this in first responders." And when I got out of the hospital, I began to research what was going on with first responders. Why did a surgeon know that there was so much organ cancer in us? And I'd seen it happen with my colleagues. I'd worked in the fire department in the private sector, and I'd seen how many of us struggled with the various maladies that affected those of us who serve on the front line as first responders, including divorce, addiction, depression, isolation, and tragically, as you know, suicide.
Yeah. Luis, you've had firsthand experience with the program, with PTS. When did you realize that you needed help, and how did the organization help you?
You know, I'm a 13-year law enforcement veteran, and throughout my career, I've had issues that have come up, getting sick, random weekends, or a whole weekend down, and just couldn't understand why. And then in September of last year, I really had a hospital stay that kind of turned my life around and had me make the decision that there's something wrong. And then I had one more in November that I was in the hospital for 4 days, and my wife and my doctor said, you need to do something. So I was pointed towards Sue and the great people at First Responder Resiliency, and I went to the program not necessarily with open eyes. It took me about a day of understanding exactly what I was going through and realizing that the other 20 people in this room are going through the exact same thing I am. And I bought in. And the tools that Sue and the great folks at First Responder Resiliency gave us really have helped me since that moment. I haven't had another incident since November of last year, and I'm 100% different.
That's wonderful. You know, and as you point out, Sue, suicide among first responders, the rates have doubled since 2016. It was the leading cause of death in police officers and firefighters in 2017 and 2018. Susan, how do you get folks who are used to being strong for other people to realize that they need help?
So that's a great question. One of the things that we really work on is helping them identify what's happening to them invisibly. So one of the things I would comment on is that pretty traditionally what's offered to us is after we have symptoms of post-traumatic stress. This organization is a proactive approach. We address this prior to people getting into the industry. That's our intention right now. We obviously are helping people like Luis who've gone through the career and been traumatized by it. But the work that we do is around the physiology of first responders and allowing them to recognize that this is science and evidence. You can't argue with science and evidence. We're not trying to convince anyone of anything. We're trying to show them this is what's happening to you physiologically. Your brain and spinal cord are being affected. We're not just talking about it. And the comment I like to make is that if stress is the #1 contributing factor to disease, then reducing stress is the #1 contributing factor to reducing disease.
You know, the other point here, which I think is so critical, is that your organization also helps reach out and serve the families of these first responders as well, to help them understand what their family member, what their loved one is going through. Luis, real quick, how critical is it to involve families in resiliency efforts, and how did that impact you?
Oh, it's huge. My wife and I, my wife and kids didn't understand what was going on with Dad. They just didn't know. And my wife came to the one-day portion of the seminar where families are allowed to or participate in this, and she walked away with a much stronger understanding of what it was I was struggling with, and on top of that, how it was I was going to deal with it. And she also uses those tools as well. It's not very often that you'll find the two of us meditating together, which, I mean, I'm a 50-year-old Hispanic male police officer. You would have never found me meditating ever.
All right. Well, you look. We sometimes, in order to get better, you do have to get outside of your comfort zone, and you have to realize that you need help and open yourself up to these new types of therapies. And bringing people together is, of course, part of that. And Susan, you and everyone at First Responders Resiliency, you are our Patriots of the Week. Luis, thank you so much for your service and for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.